Hello and welcome back to a new lecture on syntax. In our previous lecture, we discussed the CP. We said that the CP was a little more complicated than we thought it was at first. In particular, we assimilated our CP structure to X-bar schema. Now the CP has a C-bar level and a C head. The question we started with in our previous lecture was, why is it that C was optional in our old CP structure? We found out that instead C is actually not optional, but that sometimes it could be pronounced, for example with a complement, and sometimes it could be null or just unpronounced, something silent. Therefore, in all cases, C is still obligatory, just like the N in the noun phrase and the V in the verb phrase, and so on. In today's lecture, we take a look at the TP, or the tense phrase. So far, we know that the TP is as follows. Notice that the T is labeled as optional. Again, we ask the same question here. If this is a tense phrase, why is its head optional? So now we have the noun phrase, verb phrase, adjective phrase, adverb phrase, prepositional phrase, and the complementizer phrase. And in all of them, we see that the head is a must. It is obligatory. It is only the case in our TP so far that the T is optional. Not only that, but everything else here seems to look like we want it to look. It looks like the X-bar schema. So we have an intermediate level in each one, the bar level. Under TP, we are still using the multiple branching flat structure. Therefore, we need to take a second look at TP. So let's try to assimilate our TP and see what it might look like under our X-bar schema. Well, we would have a DP subject and then maybe something called a T-bar. This T-bar would give rise to our T-head and a verb phrase. But now the main problem here is that this is still optional, right? Now we don't want this to be optional because, well, quite frankly, so far it doesn't fit what everything else looks like. It doesn't make sense for this to be the only type of phrase where its head is optional. Maybe there's evidence to the contrary. So far we know that under T we can have an auxiliary. Now the auxiliary we're talking about here actually has two types. Either we're talking about modal auxiliaries like can, could, shall, should, will, would, and so on. Or we could have helping verbs. Helping verbs could be either have, or be, or do. Have could be has, or have, or had. Be could be is, or are, or am, or was, or were. Do could be do, or did. So now back to the main topic at hand. So far this looks like it is optional. Now the question is, can we make the same claim that we made for the CP in the previous lecture? Mainly that it is not optional, but rather that sometimes there's just something that is null or not pronounced, something that is silent. Now as a reminder, the reason why we are saying it is optional in the first place is that because here we have the T, modal verb will, but here we don't. And the sentence is still fine in both cases. Therefore we're saying that T is optional. Now is there any evidence that in fact T is not optional, and that in the cases where we do not have a T element, there's actually a null element that is not pronounced? If you remember from our previous lecture, we said that if two things were in complementary distribution, that means that they are instances or examples of the same phenomena. They are of the same category. Let's take a look at some examples here. So here are two sentences. In one of them, John runs fast. In the other one, our inflection, or the thing that tells us what tense this sentence is this auxiliary is. So apparently this S here tells us that we are talking about the present tense. The is here also serves the same purpose. Therefore, we could say that tense, or the present tense, can be suggested either by using the auxiliary is, or by using the suffix, the inflectional suffix S, to indicate the present. Now how can we be sure that these are instances of the same thing? That they are both tense? Well, we need to ask, are they in complementary distribution? Meaning, if we have one, is the other one blocked? Let's see. John runs fast. Here we have is and we have this, and the result is a very ill-formed sentence. Therefore, we cannot have both of them at the same time. Either we take out is and we get John runs fast, or we take out runs and we get John is fast. But both at the same time, as so, is very ill-formed. So now that we know that they are in complementary distribution, we can now make it clear what exactly this T can contain. It can contain an auxiliary verb, or it can contain the inflectional endings that we find on verbs, such as the S for the present, as in John plays. Now, is there evidence that both of these, the inflectional ending and the auxiliary, are both under T, apart from the facts that we have just shown about complementary distribution? Actually, there is. We can go back and look at conjoining again. Again, we only conjoin things that are of like nature. Phrases of the same type may conjoin with other phrases of the same type. They also have to be of the same level. So, for example, an X bar may conjoin with an X bar, but an X cannot conjoin with an X bar. An XP may not conjoin with an X or an X bar. Therefore, if we find that we can conjoin a T bar level with an inflectional ending and a T bar level with an auxiliary, then we can confirm that they are both of the same type and of the same level. Take this sentence, for example. I played in the mud and must go wash now. What we're doing here is conjoining, as so, using and. One is a T bar level with the inflectional ending as a T, and the other is a T bar level with a modal auxiliary as T. So now we know that inflectional endings and auxiliaries are in complementary distribution, which shows us that they are of the same type and that they are both examples of the same thing. They're both under the category T, and we also know that they can be conjoined, meaning that they are also, again, the same type, which is T. So now we can summarize that this T element that we're talking about here, again, can either be an auxiliary or an inflectional ending. So now again, the T contains our auxiliaries and our inflectional verb endings, like the present S. So we can easily say John will play by having will, the modal auxiliary, be under T. Great. What about John plays? Now we know that the inflectional ending is here, not here. So how can we now maintain the claim that they are both under T? See, the problem is the auxiliary is to the left of the verb, and the inflectional ending is usually to the right of the verb. How then can both of these be under the T? There's another difference now between auxiliaries and inflectional endings on the verb. Recall that the auxiliary can undergo a process called subject-auxiliary inversion. The inflectional ending cannot. So for example, in John will play, we can invert the auxiliary with the subject and get will John play. However, in John plays, we cannot move this S and invert it and have it appear before the subject. This cannot happen. So now there are two main differences we need to account for. If we are to suggest that both the auxiliaries and the inflectional endings are under T. Number one, this appears to the left of the verb, and this appears to the right. This can undergo subject, auxiliary, inversion, and this one cannot split off of the verb. So then, are we still going to maintain that both auxiliaries and inflectional endings are under T? How is this going to work? Now, one option, as suggested by Chomsky, is to suggest that, yes, both auxiliaries and inflectional endings are generated in T, There is a small little difference now between auxiliaries and the inflectional endings, which is that auxiliaries can stand alone, but inflectional endings cannot stand alone. This is an example of an inflectional ending. Now, since they cannot stand alone, what they need to do is to attach to the verb. Now, in 1957, Chomsky suggested that there is a process called affix lowering, whereby this affix would lower and attach to the verb because it cannot stand alone. So affix lowering for now is our solution to this problem. Now we know how this ends up being found to the right of the verb. And now we know why we can't split it and use it for subject-auxiliary inversion like we can with auxiliaries. Later on in this course, however, we will look at another option besides affix lowering, which is kind of seen as only one option. Another option we'll look at later on actually raises the verb instead of lowering the affix. But we'll leave that until later. To summarize then, our TP now looks just like any other X-bar schema phrase. And now we have a clear reason to suggest that T is actually not optional, it is obligatory. So in sentences like John played, we use this sentence to suggest that T was optional because there is no T here. Well, now we know that actually there is a T, which was the ED, and that we lowered it and attached it to the verb because it can't stand alone, just like we see here. So now everything seems to fit perfectly, and now our phrase structure rules look very beautiful. They all look very symmetrical. Again, here's our tense phrase, and if you notice, everything looks very similar now, and in each and every one there is a matrix level, an intermediate bar level, and a head which is obligatory in every single one. Great, now we have a very uniform looking theory. See you in the next lecture.